What if I told you that World War II didn't start in 1939 with Hitler's invasion of Poland? What if the real trigger was pulled in 20 years earlier in a palace outside Paris by men who thought they were creating lasting peace? Today we're diving into one of history's greatest ironies, how the treaty that ended the war to end all wars actually guaranteed an even deadlier conflict to follow. Welcome to World War IIpedia, where we uncover the untold stories that shaped our world. Today we're examining the Treaty of Versailles, not just as the document that ended World War I, but as the blueprint for World War II. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some historians call it the most catastrophic peace treaty in human history. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why Germany, a nation devastated by World War I, was able to rebuild and launch an even more devastating war just 2 decades later? The answer lies in the decisions made by 4 men in 1919 and the consequences of those decisions that echo through history to this day. It's January 1919. The guns have finally fallen silent after 4 years of unprecedented carnage. Over 17 million people are dead. Entire empires have collapsed. The world is exhausted, traumatized, and desperate for peace. In the opulent halls of the Palace of Versailles, 4 men hold the fate of the world in their hands. But here's what most people don't realize. These men couldn't agree on what peace should look like. Georges Clemenceau of France, nicknamed the Tiger, wanted revenge. He had lived through 2 German invasions of France and was determined it would never happen again. His solution? Crush Germany so completely that it could never rise again. Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived with his idealistic 14 points, calling for peace without victory and collective responsibility for the war. He believed in democracy, self-determination, and a new world order based on cooperation. David Lloyd George of Britain found himself caught in the middle. Personally, he agreed with Wilson's moderate approach, but his people back home were screaming for German blood. British newspapers ran headlines like, "Hang the Kaiser," and "Make Germany pay." And then there was Vittorio Orlando of Italy, focused primarily on securing territorial gains for his country. These conflicting visions created what historians now recognize as a fatal compromise, a treaty harsh enough to humiliate Germany, but not harsh enough to prevent its recovery. It was, as one historian put it, the worst of both worlds. The Treaty of Versailles rested on 4 main pillars, each designed to ensure Germany could never threaten world peace again. But as we'll see, each pillar actually helped build the foundation for an even greater war. Pillar 1, the War Guilt Clause. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept complete responsibility for starting World War I with them. Think about that for a moment. Germany had to publicly admit that the deaths of 17 million people were entirely their fault. This wasn't just about assigning blame, it was about national humiliation on an unprecedented scale. Imagine if your country was forced to sign a document stating that every tragedy, every death, every destroyed family from a global conflict was your fault alone. The psychological impact on the German people was devastating. But here's the kicker. Many Germans genuinely believed they weren't solely responsible for the war. They saw it as a complex web of alliances and miscalculations that had spiraled out of control. The War Guilt Clause felt like a leaf forced upon them at gunpoint. Pillar 2, the economic stranglehold. The reparations demanded from Germany were staggering. 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to roughly $33 billion in 1919. To put that in perspective, that's about $2.3 trillion in today's money. Germany was expected to pay this astronomical sum while simultaneously rebuilding its war-torn economy. The results were predictably catastrophic. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed the German currency. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 would cost 200 billion marks by November. People literally needed wheelbarrows full of money to buy basic necessities. Citizens found it cheaper to burn money than to buy coal for heating. This economic devastation didn't just hurt Germany's wealthy elite, it destroyed the middle class, the very foundation of democratic society. Millions of ordinary Germans saw their life savings become worthless overnight. These were the people who would later turn to extremist solutions. Pillar 3, military castration. Germany's military was reduced from one of the world's most powerful armies to a mere shadow. The German army was limited to just 100,000 men, smaller than the police force of New York City today. They were forbidden from having tanks, military aircraft, submarines, or poison gas. The German Navy was reduced to 6 battleships and a handful of smaller vessels. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heartland bordering France, was to be permanently demilitarized. This meant that Germany's most economically vital region would be defenseless against any future French aggression. Here's what the Allied leaders failed to understand. Military restrictions don't eliminate military ambition, they often intensify it. The German military establishment, humiliated and marginalized, began planning for the day they could restore their nation's strength. Pillar 4, territorial amputation. Germany lost approximately 13% of its European territory and all of its overseas colonies. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. The Saar Basin, rich in coal and steel, was placed under League of Nations control for 15 years. Parts of Prussia were given to the newly created Poland, creating the infamous Polish corridor that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. These territorial losses weren't just lines on a map. They represented the loss of valuable industrial and agricultural resources that Germany desperately needed to pay its reparations. It was a vicious cycle. Germany lost the means to pay, but was still expected to pay. Here's where the story takes a crucial turn that most people don't fully understand. The German military leadership, led by generals like Erich Ludendorff, had essentially abandoned the war effort by late 1918. They knew Germany was beaten and pushed for an armistice to avoid a complete military collapse. But when the new civilian government, the Weimar Republic, signed the Treaty of Versailles, these same military leaders began spreading a poisonous lie: that Germany hadn't really lost the war on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by treacherous politicians at home. This became known as the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth. The politicians who signed the treaty were branded as November criminals, traitors who had sold out Germany to its enemies. This myth was historically false. Germany's military situation in 1918 was hopeless, and the generals knew it. But it provided a convenient scapegoat for Germany's humiliation and would later become a cornerstone of Nazi propaganda. The Treaty of Versailles also established the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson's dream of a world organization that would prevent future wars through diplomacy and collective security. On paper, it was a revolutionary idea. Nations would work together to resolve disputes peacefully. But the League was doomed from the start. The United States Senate, in a fit of isolationist sentiment, refused to ratify the treaty. America, the world's emerging superpower and the architect of the League, never joined its own creation. Without American participation, the League lacked the military and economic power to enforce its decisions. It became what critics called a debating society, capable of passing resolutions but powerless to stop determined aggressors. Throughout the 1920s, the harsh terms of Versailles continued to poison German society. Every economic crisis, every political commotion, every social problem was blamed on the treaty and the November criminals who had signed it. Enter Adolf Hitler, a failed artist and World War I veteran who understood better than anyone how to exploit German resentment. In speech after speech, he hammered home the same themes. Germany had been betrayed, the treaty was a national humiliation, and only he could restore German greatness. Hitler's rise wasn't inevitable, but the Treaty of Versailles provided him with the perfect propaganda tool. Every clause of the treaty became ammunition for his extremist message. The war guilt clause, a lie forced upon Germany by its enemies. The reparations, an attempt to enslave the German people forever. The military restrictions, a plot to keep Germany defenseless. Now here's where the story gets more complex, and this is something most history classes never teach. Not all historians agree that the Treaty of Versailles caused World War II. Some argue that this narrative is itself a piece of Nazi propaganda that we've accepted uncritically. Consider this, though. Germany had imposed equally harsh, if not harsher, terms on Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. That treaty stripped Russia of 1/3 of its population, half its industrial capacity, and its best agricultural land. If Germany could impose such terms when it was winning, why should it complain when similar terms were imposed on it? Furthermore, fascist movements arose across Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. In Italy, Spain, Hungary, and elsewhere, even in countries that weren't affected by Versailles. This suggests that the treaty alone wasn't responsible for the rise of extremism. Some historians argue that the real problem wasn't the treaty itself, but the failure to enforce it. When Hitler began rearming Germany in the 1930s, when he remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, when he annexed Austria in 1938, the Western democracies did nothing. They had the power to stop Hitler early, but they chose appeasement instead. This brings us to perhaps the most crucial point. The Treaty of Versailles might have worked if it had been consistently enforced. But by the 1930s, Britain and France were more afraid of communism than fascism. They saw Hitler as a bulwark against Soviet expansion and were willing to overlook his violations of the treaty. When Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, he later admitted that if France had responded with force, Germany would have been forced to withdraw. The German military wasn't ready for war, but France did nothing, and Hitler learned a crucial lesson. The Western democracies were weak and divided. This pattern of appeasement continued through the annexation of Austria, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and right up until the invasion of Poland. Each time Hitler grew bolder, and each time the democracies failed to act. By 1939, the toxic combination of German resentment, economic instability, failed diplomacy, and Western appeasement had created the perfect storm. Hitler had successfully convinced the German people that they were the victims of an unjust peace, and that only through war could they reclaim their rightful place in the world. The invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, wasn't just the beginning of World War II. It was the inevitable result of 20 years of unresolved tensions that traced directly back to the Palace of Versailles. But here's the tragic irony. World War II was far more devastating than World War I. The war to end all wars had produced a peace that guaranteed an even more terrible war. Over 70 million people would die in World War II, more than 4 times the casualties of World War I. So what can we learn from this historical catastrophe? First, that peace treaties must be either magnanimous or completely crushing. The middle ground of humiliation without prevention is the most dangerous path of all. Second, that economic stability is crucial for political stability. The hyperinflation and economic chaos of the 1920s that Germany created allowed conditions for extremism to flourish. Third, that international institutions are only as strong as their most powerful members make them. The League of Nations failed because the United States abandoned it, just as any international organization will fail without committed leadership. Finally, that appeasement in the face of aggression doesn't preserve peace. It merely postpones and amplifies conflict. The Treaty of Versailles stands as one of history's greatest cautionary tales. Designed to ensure lasting peace, it instead guaranteed future war. The men who crafted it in 1919 believed they were creating a new world order, but they were actually writing the prologue to humanity's darkest chapter. Understanding this history isn't just academic. It's essential for recognizing the patterns that can lead from peace to war, from democracy to dictatorship, from hope to catastrophe. The ghosts of Versailles remind us that the price of peace is eternal vigilance, and that the decisions we make in victory can determine whether we face defeat in the future. The next time you hear someone say that World War II began in 1939, remember this: the real seeds of that conflict were planted in 1919 in a palace outside Paris by men who thought they were ending war forever. What do you think? Was the Treaty of Versailles the primary cause of World War II, or were there other factors at play? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to World War IIpedia for more untold stories from history's most pivotal moments. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know about the past, because the truth is often more complex and more fascinating than the simple stories we're taught. If this video opened your eyes to a different perspective on World War II's origins, remember to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest historical revelations.